today's discussion is to talk about obviously the new definition of dyslexia that was put out from the International Dyslexia Association. And I thought this was a good opportunity to kind of reach out to our members of the public and talk about what does that mean, what does the new definition say. And from my perspective, I tend to give this talk a lot about the biological basis of dyslexia and where it comes from, to give some clarifying ideas and thoughts about how we do this and why how we diagnose, and thoughtfulness about the diagnosis. So as we let me see if I can. Okay, all right. So this is the previous definition that was circa 2003 2004, that from the International Dyslexia Association and NIH, that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin, characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding abilities, and with resulting from a deficit in the phonological component of the language. They also talked about secondary consequences in reading comprehension, and vocabulary and background knowledge. There's some other pieces to the definition, but these are the primary ones that are really important and things that have really changed, or we'll focus on what has changed and what's new. So as we look at what is in the new definition, and this isn't the entire definition. If you go to the web address that's below, you can see the full definition and the description from IDA of what they changed and why they changed it. They describe dyslexia as again a specific learning disability, again characterized by difficulties in word reading and or spelling that involve accuracy, speed, or both. And what's nice here is varying depending on the orthography. We'll talk about that. The causes of dyslexia are complex and involve a combination of genetic, neurobiological, and environmental influences. So something I'm going to dive into a little bit. And underlying difficulties with the phonological and morphological processing are common but not universal. So you notice a big change there. And that early oral language weaknesses often foreshadow these literacy challenges. I think these are critical and changes and important changes, and that I do agree with, and things that those like me have been who've been studying the neurobiology of dyslexia and the behaviors that surround it, that these are really important changes. So I'm going to start with the idea of specific learning disability. Now, one of the questions, and even they wrestled with whether to keep especially the term disability as opposed to difficulties, which sometimes they use in other places like Europe. But one of the issues of this is this notion of a discrepancy model, right? So one of the things that they do try to get rid of is the idea of a discrepancy model with IQ, which I'll talk about. And they keep the idea of difficulties with word reading and or spelling. And that's an important piece of it, because there are lots of factors in reading disabilities and language disabilities in general, but dyslexia in particular is something that we tend to talk about as affecting that word reading process. We also they talk about it as occurring along a continuum. So, and that's not anything new, but making that more explicit in this definition, and acknowledging comorbidities. Now, like I said, some of the things have changed in terms of the neurobiological origin term that was in the original one. One of the factors, or one of the things that seem to give is a sense of biological determinism, that the brain is this way and it's always this way from birth. And I will get into, there are genetic influences on dyslexia, but it's a lot more complex than I think what many have been led to believe. It's important to acknowledge environmental impacts, and that there are some neurobiology or evidence that has been gathered since 2003, especially, really kind of points to a complex set of both brain areas as well as environmental issues that can change the brain and thus lead to reading disabilities. Um, and so, in short, one of the things I'll try to make clear is that the etiology of reading disability, of dyslexia, is complex. And the idea that it results from a phonological processing deficit, again, I'm glad to see that they've moved beyond this phonological deficit. They're common but not universal. And one of the things that we'll talk about is that constellation model, and the idea that there's a lot of different factors, and some of those factors could also lead to the phonological processing deficit. And they could stem from early oral language issues. One of the things I'm disappointed in a little bit is that they don't acknowledge cognitive factors, but such as attention, working memory, and they are also common, but not always universal. So one of the things when I talk about dyslexia, I often talk about it as being bike riding disorder. And I know a lot of that can often kind of catch people by surprise, but one of the critical ideas is that there's no gene that codes for reading, right? So reading and literacy, writing systems are a cultural convention. We have created them, right? So while oral language we can think of as being something that is potentially innate or that we're expected to do, reading is not something that we are biologically expected to do. And so this idea that a single gene or set of genes is going to code for reading is not something that we would expect. It's too early in our evolutionary history, right? Writing systems have only been around for about 6,000 years. And, even as of the 1940s, only 40% of Americans were literate. So our push, or this evolutionary pressures need high sets of a high set of pressure in order to be able to be something that's biologically driven, or to develop a gene for. So many of you may have seen the writing rope, or the reading rope, I mean. And so one of the things that we talk about is with this with this reading rope, hit by accident, is that, right, there's a lot of, in red there, the oral language factors, vocabulary, language structures, syntax, morphology, verbal reasoning, those abilities to make inferences, knowledge of story grammars, and literacy knowledge and background knowledge, right? These are all factors in language that are oral language that are part of literacy. And then in the blue there are those factors that are in that word decoding or word recognition system. I tend to like to put these, I tend to like the reading pyramid in a way, because it shows the fact that those later skills are built on these early skills. So if you weaken any one of those lower level pillars, right, then the whole thing will crumble or fall. And so this is in many ways how I like to think about reading. And so if those underlying components, that like phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, if those factors are weak, then so will those higher ability to get to reading comprehension will be weak. And to make clear that this system that resides in our long-term memory system, right, it's built on cognitive architecture, right, that involves visual processing, auditory processing, motor processing, right? And that information has to come in from those sensory systems, and that's filtered through our attentional system, our working memory. Can we hold those things in mind, right? The cat, right? Blend them together, and that's all going to depend on processing speed, right? And all that is needed just in order to build those lower pillars and all of the pillars of the reading pyramid. Now, as I said before, right, this idea that IQ, or that we would use this discrepancy model, which we have in the past, of identifying a child as having a reading disability because it was discrepant from, it was what they call otherwise unexpected, right? And the way that they would characterize unexpected, one is obviously if they didn't have a lack of formal education, but two is the idea that, right, expected meaning they didn't have some major cognitive impairment, and IQ was used in order to look at this or identify this otherwise unexpected model, and they've taken that out of the definition, which is good. And one of the things that we know is that IQ is not necessarily indicative of anything that is going to tell us something about someone with a learning disability. What you can see here from this data is you can see the skilled readers there in the dotted line, and those with diagnosed with a reading disability with the IQ discrepancy versus those without. And what you can see there kind of is that there's really no difference between the two of them. So using IQ as a model for identification is not appropriate. And one of the things is that, right, this ability to identify and diagnose is really understanding that it occurs along a continuum, right? It's that reading disability is really something that you're making I want to say somewhat arbitrary cutoff at the bottom 5th percentile, bottom 7th percentile, 10th percentile, right? Is that there is no kind of biological validity for where the cutoff is. And this is akin to things like heart disease or hypertension, right? Where a doctor says you have all these risk factors, and they say, I'm diagnosing you with heart disease or with hypertension, right? And so it occurs relative to the severity of the disorder that the professional sees. And so there is no clear cut, like I said, biological validity or biological cutoff of what is dyslexia. So as we talked about this idea of a phonological deficit, one of the reasons for getting rid of it, and as they mentioned, is different orthographies have different presentations. And so if you look at other orthographies such as German or Italian, they don't necessarily have this this phonological deficit. Oftentimes what you see in most languages is problems with fluency, but not with decoding. What we also tend to see is deficits with other lower level sensory integration. So I'll show some of that brain data in a second. But these lower level sensory processes, like your auditory system or your visual system or your attentional system, may be just as much driving those phonological deficits. So those phonological deficits may just as well be an outcome of whatever the underlying cause is. One of the other things that we look at and think about is that there may be some issue with the implicit learning process, or nowadays we'll talk about this as statistical learning or learning from consistency. But the fact that those with learning struggles, they need lots and lots of explicit repetition and explicit feedback. Because that implicit system to kind of decode and see patterns, that those may be where some of the deficits lie with individuals that have this particular difficulty. And as I've noted before, that this is a heterogeneous population. It stems from a variety of deficits. Developmental language delay, as brought up, and Courtney will, as a speech and language pathologist, can get into. We see comprehension failures that can come out as a byproduct, but also other issues like developmental motor delay. There's a high comorbidity between developmental motor delay and reading disability. It's actually one of the highest at 0.8. That's a 80% chance of having one if you have the other. Other attention deficits, we know the comorbidity there again is between 0.4 and 0.6. And other learning disabilities such as dyscalculia, there's a comorbidity between 0.4 and 0.8. If we look at attention deficits, things like attention, again, getting difficulty getting started on tasks, arousal, motivation, difficulty selectively attending to things, difficulty inhibiting information, right, that distractibility, working memory, so holding that information in that attentional span for long periods of time, and then processing speed, slow, sluggish, kind of processing. These are all factors that can contribute to reading disability and other learning disabilities. And as I mentioned, that comorbidity with ADHD is fairly high. If you look at just some of the data, this is just to give you a sense of what that looks like. Studies on orienting of attention. In this task, it's a very simple task. You stare at the fixation cross, and then a circle comes up, and you have to get prepared to move your eyes, and then you see a dot will appear on the next, in one of those spots in the next, slide that comes up, and you just have to move your eyes to that particular dot once that target comes up. And what you can see is that your typical readers, if that dot appears, 4 degrees, which is, right next to that fixation cross where you're supposed to start, versus 8 versus 12 degrees, right? In typical readers, right, there's a pretty good, progression of the further it is away from the center, the longer it takes you to move your eyes. But you can see with individuals with dyslexia, their eyes, it's a flat line. There's no difference between whether it's 4 degrees, 8 degrees, or 12 degrees. And that suggests from attentional point of view that their focus of attention may be all over the place, or maybe very wide as opposed to very narrow, which may be contributing to their reading difficulties and learning difficulties. We also know about lower level auditory processing deficits. So Paula Talal introduced this way back in the late 1970s, early 80s, of the auditory temporal processing deficit. Usha Goswami talked about the auditory, the speech envelope, so that processing of speech in the speech stream, and the spectrum of frequencies that happen. And Nina Kraus has looked at the auditory brainstem response, and Frank Ramus has looked at neural entrainment. And there's a lot of data to suggest that, for some, not all, like I said, for some children with these deficits, that it is in that auditory processing, that speed of processing here. So this is the early Talal studies, looking at those who have dyslexia and a family history of dyslexia, right, that they're at the slower end. So this task is very simple. It's hearing 2 beeps, beep, beep. And you have to say whether the second tone is higher in frequency than the first tone or lower in frequency. And they would speed it up. And those with, like I said, dyslexia would tend to have a harder time making that discrimination. Other data, like I said, coming from the brain and the auditory system, shows that there are differences in the brain response to both sound and noise, amplitude modulation of sound. You can think of that as volume, and as well as frequencies. So there's all sorts of data to suggest that the brain is having, like I said, again, in some, not all, but is having a hard time responding to the sound appropriately. We've seen visual and auditory processing deficits. This used to be called, the one view of this was the magnocellular deficit. Guinevere Eden was involved with, and she since has moved away from. But there are some findings to suggest that that these visual processing deficits are there. At Stanford, colleagues of mine are also looking at this again more recently. And here's, again, data from Guinevere Eden's lab at Georgetown. Having these little these are visual patterns, and you just have to see and determine which direction they seem like they're moving or oriented in. Another version of this is just seeing a set of dots that are more or less moving in one direction or another, and just determining which direction they're moving in. And what the data shows is that you can see this is the results on the Woodcock-Johnson word ID and word attack, that the poor performance on these tasks is highly correlated with reading ability. So, you can see that as you perform more poorly on these tasks, it's correlated with your word attack and word ID scores, your pseudo word reading. And you do see differences in the brain. And so those differences are associated with it, and with Guinevere sees is when you look at age match controls, so your peers of the same age, there are differences in the brain. If you have controls that are reading matched, you don't necessarily. So if you're a fifth grader reading at a third grade level, compared to other fifth graders, you see brain differences. Compared to other third graders at that same reading level, you don't see differences. All right, so what does all this mean? So one way of talking about this is saying it's complex, right? It's not the simple view of dyslexia. It's not a discrete syndrome, right? There's lots of what we call phenotypic behaviors that can occur. So that auditory processing, the visual processing, that attentional processing, and those phenotypic behaviors can be across different diagnoses. So they can occur in dyscalculia or math disability. And it really is just this idea of taking a constellation approach, right? That you have all of these different factors that can lead to failures in developing strong reading skills, so thus occurring along that continuum. And we talk about this in the genetics and the behavioral genetics field as equifinality, which is you can come from different genetic backgrounds. You can have different genes with different phenotypes, but end up at the same place. So you can end up in the place of having a reading disability despite having these different, very different genetic profiles. On the other hand, you can have two people with the very similar genetic profiles, but have very different, right? That's multifinality. So identical twins, right? One develops dyslexia and the other one doesn't. And it's associated, like I said, if you look at this idea of being transdiagnostic, this is a term that has emerged in the psychological literature of looking at the fact that some of these different underlying factors cut across different disorders. So social communication, hyperactivity, inattention, phonological processing can cut across dyslexia, dyscalculia, developmental language disorder, as well as autism and ADHD. So just to give a quick recap, literacy is a cultural convention built along this cognitive architecture that's intended for other purposes. Dyslexia or reading disabilities, it's multifaceted, and so the underlying etiology, right? Understanding that there are different strengths and weaknesses, a cognitive profile, if you will, of a child is important to the treatment. There's some question about whether it's important to the diagnosis of it, because for diagnosis, it may be just important to do that word attack, that word ID, the things that are in our screeners. And then one of the other things to understand is that there's more than one way to arrive at dyslexia and associated outcomes. So it's not just a phonological deficit that leads you there. There could be other factors that lead you there. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Courtney.
Alrighty, thank you. My name's Courtney Overton. I am certified by the International Dyslexia Association as a structured literacy dyslexia interventionist, also certified by the American Speech Language Hearing Association as a speech language pathologist. So I do have dual roles in the sense that I'm looking at dyslexia from in dyslexia interventionist perspective, but also looking at a speech language pathologist perspective. So when we're talking about early oral language, that really gets me excited that that's now been included. In my first slide here, I want to emphasize the benchmark of persistence. So a critical component of the new definition does ensure that we differentiate dyslexia from a temporary literacy lag. So the difficulties must persist as the student participates in instruction. So this persistence term that we're now seeing does distinguish dyslexia from these transitory challenges. So while comparing a student to national norms is ideal, the definition suggests that using classroom peers' expected progress as a reliable benchmark is actually more appropriate to identify children who need support. And we have to keep this in mind, especially in underperforming schools, because this is going to be different as we look across from school to school. So this underscores that a dyslexia diagnosis requires assessing a student's deficit in the face of appropriate educational opportunities. In the next slide for underlying indicators, um, Dr. Bolger talked about phonological processing, which is still important, but now we also have to think about morphological processing and also the early oral language weaknesses, because when we're thinking about underlying issues like phonological processes, which is the ability to hear, identify, and manipulate the sounds or the phonemes in spoken language, um, those are very important because reading requires connecting sounds to letters. So when I'm teaching my speech sound disorders course here at University of Maryland in the Hearing and Speech Sciences department, I always talk about this as, things that you can do in the dark. So you can hear, you can manipulate. If I say the word cup and I ask you to say the word cup without the k sound, you should be able to produce the word up. So that does not require looking at anything. It's talking about the spoken language component. And later on, we will then connect those sounds to letters. So my background as a speech language pathologist does emphasize that we also look at the morphological processing, which is the system for building words from smaller, meaningful units, and those units are called morphemes. So we can have the word dog, which is one morpheme, then we can add the letter S and we can get the word dogs. Now we have two morphemes, one dog, more than one dog is dogs. So if we see that a child is having difficulty with phonological processing and difficulty with morphological processing, that typically means that there's an early oral language weakness, and that foreshadows the literacy challenges, and that indicates an increased risk for dyslexia. So we can see these early indicators very early, as preschool. So, 3 or 4 years old. So we don't have to really wait until they're school age, wait until they're 5 years old, wait until they're kindergartners to start introducing this explicit instruction. So these underlying difficulties are common indicators, but I will emphasize that they are not universal. So whenever we're performing an evaluation, it must be comprehensive, looking at all the areas of reading and writing and all the areas, including these phonological processing areas and morphological processing. So we also must move past the diagnosis. So when we're thinking about the new dyslexia definition that was just released a few months ago in October of 2025, it does explicitly remove the term of other cognitive abilities. And this change discourages the historically popular, yet unsupported, as Dr. Bolger said, practice of requiring that IQ discrepancy. So we no longer need the IQ discrepancy for a diagnosis of dyslexia because, as we saw in the previous slides, you can have an IQ of 85, you can have an IQ of 120, and you can still have a diagnosis of dyslexia. So the research confirms that the word level literacy difficulties can occur across a full range of cognitive profiles. And general intelligence does not determine the nature of the difficulty of, or how a student responds to the intervention plan. We also have to think about these co-occurring developmental disorders. We've talked about developmental language disorder. We've also talked about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Uh, Dr. Bolger also mentioned earlier dyscalculia. So all of these are common, as we say in the speech world, comorbidities, but they are distinct conditions and they're not necessarily a part of the definition of dyslexia. However, we do have to acknowledge them during evaluation and intervention planning. So, when we're thinking about these coexisting conditions, they are not necessarily a part of dyslexia, but they can occur along with dyslexia. In my practice in working with dyslexic children, I do have to think about these foundational principles of effective intervention. So the IDA definition does emphasize early identification. So I may not diagnose dyslexia with a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, but I may see those early indicators and I will start to administer this specific intervention that's based in the science of reading because we want to make sure that we're providing language and literacy intervention very early on during the earliest school years because it will significantly improve outcomes. And later on, we'll talk about how it will also improve long-term well-being. So this intervention must be built upon the foundational principles, which are typically described as explicit and systematic instruction. So, first, we're going to target basic letter sound correspondence, and I typically follow the recipe for reading sequence. So we typically start with instruction of the letter C and how the letter C says k, and we'll work on that for an entire week. We'll work on letter formation. We're also talking about excuse me, words that start with the k sound, and we'll start brainstorming some words that we can think of together. And then in terms of decoding, we're not quite ready for decoding words yet because we're just working on the single letter correspondence. Later on in the following week, in the second week, we introduce the letter O, and we're always working on short vowels first before we introduce long vowels. So we're letting them know that the letter O says ah, like octopus. Again, brainstorming words together that start with that sound, and then also targeting letter formation. Letter formation is always multi-sensory, so we're talking about it. That plays into the auditory piece. We're also using different types of material. So before we actually write the letter, we form it with Play-Doh. We write it in shaving cream. We talk about it in lots of different ways. So that is speaking to the tactile piece, but also the visual component. And after lots of practice, then we will pick up a pencil and write the letter with a pencil and paper. Then the fourth week, we address the letter D and how it says duh. And now, when you think about moving from C to O to D, those are very similar in terms of how they look. So we start with C and then we can close it and we can make an O. And then when we go from O to D, we're simply drawing an extended stem. So when we're thinking about the multisensory component to reading instruction, thinking about letter formation is a key component there and making sure that everything is systematic and we're slowly introducing these new ideas in a very precise and very well thought out way. So the intervention has to be explicit And so that means we're only working on one letter per week. It has to be systematic. So we have a specific sequence that we're following. And the way that we're slowly introducing these new concepts, it does help target the persistent word level difficulties that we see with our dyslexic learners. On the next slide, we're talking about the continuum and the secondary consequences, because the new definition does talk about these secondary consequences. So, word level literacy abilities are falling along this continuum. So, as Dr. Bolger said before, there's no cutoff, it's a continuum. So, you can present as mild, moderate, severe. There's different levels of severity. So, because it is a continuum, intervention cannot be rigid, it cannot be generic. We do have these scripted programs that will help us with our instruction, but we sometimes have to adapt that script depending on what type of learner that we're interacting with. So, customization is essential. And when we're thinking again about the 2025 definition of dyslexia, it does actually emphasize these secondary consequences to reflect the lived experience of a dyslexic. So when we're designing that intervention plan, we have to look beyond just decoding, looking beyond that letter sound correspondence. So we have to think about how issues with decoding can then lead to issues like reduced vocabulary growth, written expression challenges, and the profound impact that that can have on a student's psychological well-being and also their self-esteem. So when we're developing an intervention plan, yes, we can use these, scripted programs, but we do have to customize those to our specific learners. And we have to think about how their experience in reduced vocabulary, issues with written expression, can then lead to issues with self-esteem. So that's why we do really have to focus on the whole child rather than sticking to, a rigid, generic type of program. So when we are developing our intervention plan, we do have to think about adjusting the intensity and the focus. So sometimes people talk about a primary deficit in the area of phonological awareness. Sometimes people talk about difficulty with morphological analysis. There's also the speed and automaticity piece as it relates to fluency. So that's just looking at the specific deficits, which you can likely see on a standardized assessment. And then we then tweak for the coexisting conditions. So recognizing that co-occurring conditions like DLD, like ADHD, like dyscalculia are distinct, but they are comorbidities that can occur along with dyslexia. So that requires simultaneously consideration in that plan. And then third, addressing the secondary consequences, such as those vocabulary gaps that are resulting from reduced reading. So if you're having difficulty decoding, it's going to take you an extensive amount of time to decode a specific word. And now you can read the word, but then you have to attach meaning to it. And then you have to be able to read it in an entire sentence, an entire passage, an entire book. So if you're struggling at the decoding level, that's going to lend itself to reduced reading experiences. And finally, the intervention must include support for the psychological well-being. So counseling through issues like anxiety, self-esteem is going to be super important, especially as children grow older and they start to advance to high school and they're thinking about going to college or thinking about starting a career. We have to talk them through those different types of scenarios and talk about some accommodations perhaps that they could request as they matriculate. And on our next slide, we are talking about beyond academics. So we talked about how the new definition of dyslexia requires us to look beyond core reading scores and account for the whole child. So, a profound and often neglected aspect of dyslexia is the development of secondary consequences related to self-perception, related to motivation, which can explicitly include things like anxiety, low self-esteem, depression. And when students are continually struggling with reading and writing, perhaps they were, diagnosed in the third grade and now they're in 11th grade and they're thinking about college. That can be really overwhelming for any child to think about going to college and moving on to the next level. But a dyslexic learner, they might feel defeated. They may say, why would I go to college? I can't do this or I can't do that. And that does relate to what we call learned helplessness. So we need to make sure that we are empowering them and teaching them how to advocate for themselves. So I do think that, at some point it is important for a dyslexic learner to know that he or she is dyslexic and to participate in their own IEP meetings so they have an understanding of what their goals are and they have an understanding of what types of accommodations that are afforded to them, whether that be in the classroom setting or in the testing setting, because our goal and intervention is to build competency, and competency can lead to self-advocacy. And that is a goal that, they can carry on with them throughout their entire life, throughout adulthood. So as we provide our explicit and systematic instruction, yes, that's important, but we also have to enable them to develop this growth mindset because increased competence leads to increased confidence. So we can ultimately improve their long-term well-being by looking at the whole child and making sure that we're addressing all of these different areas simultaneously. And then finally, we say fidelity to the principles, not to the script. The new definition of dyslexia talks about these, co-occurring conditions and also customization. So we have to think about this effective intervention for dyslexia that is including things like structured literacy, and also thinking about a systematic and sequential approach. But we also have to consider the that dyslexia is multifactorial and it does exist along a continuum of severity. And then we have also discussed these coexisting conditions, which are distinct, but they can co-occur. And so for a student with both dyslexia and ADHD, the principles of systematic phonics do remain the focus, but sometimes we have to think about our delivery as well. So you can have, as we said, these scripted programs, but sometimes you have to throw that away because, we have to think about these accommodations as well and potentially incorporating elements with a dyslexic slash ADHD learner. Maybe they do need frequent short breaks in order to be successful during those longer assignments and testing conditions. So our fidelity has to be to the underlying principles of instruction that's rooted in the science of reading and not necessarily rooted to this rigid script that ignores our students' unique learning profiles. So if you have any questions, please place them in the chat. We are very grateful that you have joined us during your lunch break today. We really appreciate you coming and coming to support Mile. So what questions do you all have? Okay, got it.
Since somebody's formulating, you can come off mute and ask. I can. Let me see if I can.
Oh, yeah, you don't have to type it.
Yeah, feel free to come off mute. Unless.
Ryan, yes, we are recording the presentation. Do you know
Yeah,
how we are
it
sharing that?
will. It'll be posted on the Mile website, so we'll send a link.
Okay, we'll send a link.
So that's a good question about will it impact education eligibility? No, in fact, one of the things, if you go to the website at IDA, they say, a lot of the ways that they framed it was basically to not change eligibility, not in any substantial way. Um, I think if anything, it makes it a little more flexible. Like I said, they taking the emphasis off of just a phonological deficit and putting it, talking about it as being on a continuum. I think that it increases the eligibility in many ways for the diagnosis. I think one thing to think about is the nature of how it could be comorbid with other disorders, so that I mean, most school systems, if a child has an impact, a special educator can diagnose a child right based on the fact that something is having educational impact in the area of reading, so that would continue to allow them to identify somebody with a SLD in reading. So it doesn't change the definition or the diagnostic category in any way. Any other thoughts or questions? No. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate everybody coming
Oh,
and
we have a hand raised.
sorry. Go ahead. Oh, Rick.
Hi, Dr. Bolger. Hi, Courtney. I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation. I remember when Courtney was mentioning her research, it got me thinking of my classmate in the doctoral program that never knew that she had dyslexia until like a few weeks ago. And it's just interesting because I also work for the Weingarten Center. So I work to help students with accommodations. And a lot of them don't know when to get diagnosed or how to reach out for it. So I think that the new definition and the new research that you guys are leading is very informative. So I just thank you for that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that don't get diagnosed until very late, and I think that's a that's a problem. It's a very critical issue. So yeah, absolutely.
Is Mile involved in research of various reading curriculums that are being used in Maryland public schools?
Yes, Mile conducted the statewide literacy review back in 2024, where we did look at the reading curriculums across all of the school districts. Those reviews are posted on the MSDE, the Maryland State Department of Education website. I think one of the things that we do see is that because of the ready to read, sorry, the Maryland Leads Act money. So the ESSER funds, one of the things that the State Department of Education did with the ESSER funds was put a science of reading component there that if those districts that wanted to get that access to that money had to purchase materials that and train and teacher professional development on structured literacy, and the materials had to follow science of reading, this kind of standards of being explicit, systematic, structured literacy programs. Um, I would, yeah, so 22 of the 24 Maryland districts did purchase those under the Maryland Needs Act. An additional district also did that within the past year and a half. And yeah, and our other district also has pilot programming with those materials. So we do know about the reading curriculums that are in the public schools in the 24 districts.
Being that we aren't talking DSM here, is diagnose still an okay term to use? I hear some say identify or other terms. Do you see this all as synonymous?
Um, yeah, to identify or diagnose a child. So I mean, the I guess that there's various ways. I think
Mhm.
identification, especially from the educational system. Yeah, I think it's a yeah psychologists, yeah, and psychiatrists, can have one criteria for diagnosis, and school systems have another criteria for diagnosis. Not that they shouldn't be that different, but sometimes they can be. Obviously, in the educational system, they have to see educational impact um in the area of reading. And so official identification in the educational system may start may be different or look slightly differently than official
Mhm.
diagnosis from a professional in the psychological or psychiatric field.
Yeah, in the school systems, I worked for Fairfax County Public Schools in the past. And when I participated in the eligibility meetings, we always saw specific learning disability in the area of reading. So we typically didn't see the term dyslexia used much in those types of meetings. So identify is more, you know, appropriate in the school setting. I will say also, I own a private practice where we do diagnose dyslexia as speech language pathologists, and we do say diagnose, and we do use the DSM codes because a lot of our clientele are looking to submit some paperwork to their insurance company to get reimbursed for the services that we're providing because we do not accept insurance, but we do diagnose, and we also do provide a super bill, which is a medically coded receipt that they can then submit to their medical insurance company to obtain partial reimbursement for services related to dyslexia.
Yeah, and Jami has a question, Jim. I hear people are referring to dyslexia as a language-based learning disorder. Is this accurate? It's still in school under SLD. So you know, it, it's thought to be that, language, that language issues are at the core, thought to be at the heart of it. As I kind of referred to, when we're talking about the etiology of dyslexia, it could be complex, right? Attention, visual processing can also play a role there too. So I think because literacy is in the realm of language writ large, it does end up fall. People will say it's a language based learning disorder. Um, yeah, I think it gets a little messy because um, you can have completely fine oral language in many ways and still have end up with dyslexia. So the question is there some what is it that underlying phonological processing? But we see people with fine phonological awareness and still have dyslexia, which may indicate that there's a visual or sensory integration issue between the visual and the auditory. So it's yeah, I think from the school systems being a learning disability, and why the MTSS or RTI process of, we've seen that the child is struggling in learning, we've attempted to do intervention and they're not responding, that suggests that there's a difficulty in the learning process, right? So thus it's a specific, disability in learning or a specific problem in the learning process. So I do, yeah, I think that calling it a language-based learning disorder, I'm not against it, but it's not the only part of the etiology. So I guess there's could be more to the etiology of it. How can educators communicate this new understanding of dyslexia to families and stakeholders in a way that reduces stigma around diagnosing? Um, yeah, I think I don't know, Courtney, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have thoughts. So with the term diagnosis, it does have that connotation of it relating to a disorder, which is why DJ said, other countries may call it a difference or a difficulty. Whenever I'm having a difficult conversation about a disorder such as dyslexia, ASD, autism spectrum disorder, I always say that diagnosis is going to lead to additional resources. So I want to take the stigma away from it and talk about how an actual diagnosis can lead, thank you, can lead to additional resources that could be intervention in the schools with the special educator, with the reading specialist. It could lead to other interventions, working with a tutor, private tutor, or a private speech language pathologist. And then that also leads to, as I said earlier, different resources related to accommodation. So perhaps the student needs preferential seating. They need additional breaks while they're participating in assignments or tests. Thank you. If they have this diagnosis, it can be empowering and lead to additional resources. So that's how I like to frame it, which helps to reduce that stigma.
Yeah, and I think that going back to that idea that it's a neurodiversity that that different aspects of neurodiversity can lead to difficulties in the learning process for reading. So um, I think it could reduce the stigma a little bit in that way as well, which is there's a lot of neurodivergence, and this neurodivergence is just one thing that's preventing me from you know doing that word reading part, and the but you have all sorts of other capabilities. So I think just understanding that this is really a facet of neurodiversity.
Thank you, Courtney and Dr. Bolger, for your response.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I thank everybody for joining today, and we look forward to you guys joining our next Lunch and Learn.